These sessions are brought to you by obviously University of Minnesota Extension, but also generous support from the Minnesota Soybean and Corn Research and Promotion Councils. And so we thank them for their support. My name is Angie Peltier. I work for the University of Minnesota Extension as a crops educator, and I'm stationed in Crookston. Today, we welcome two panelists. We have Daigh. He is an associate professor of soil physics and hydrology at the Department of Soil Science at North Dakota State University. We also have Jodi DeJong-Hughes. She is an extension educator in water quality who works out of Wilmer and also works for the University of Minnesota Extension. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started here today. These sessions are meant to have more of an informal discussion type format, although we will start out with a bit of a presentation and just frame the discussion going forward. We have last week's session already up and available to watch on YouTube. And so we'll do the same thing next week for this session. With that, thank you all for coming here today, and I will turn it over to our panelists, Aaron and Jodi.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction. So again, thank you for the opportunity to come and speak and be a part of this discussion this morning. This is always great. The topic of soil compaction always comes around. It's every few years. If it hasn't been talked about, it gets talked about again. So we're going to focus on soil compaction today. And to begin off with, I'm just going to quickly talk about what it is. What is soil compaction? Talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to turn it over to Jodi and to talk about some of the factors dealing with compaction. Then we'll open it up for all your questions that you may have. So what is soil compaction? Well, very basic starting with is that if kind of starting with a cartoon here, if you think about if you put any kind of stress or pressure or load down onto the ground and it starts pushing on a point, it's going to cause the soil to start leaning on the particles in soil just adjacent to it. And that's where the highest zone of kind of compaction or really stress, even before it compacts, where just the stress is going to occur at. But then those particles also lean on other particles, and it's a little less stress because it's just spread out more. It has more particles to kind of have a chance to support itself, and it keeps spreading down and down. And so if you jump back to like a soil profile, you kind of get these rings of different stress amounts. So, the highest stress would be up close to wherever the load would be. This, for example, might be an example of a tractor tire or anything else leaning down on that soil. And the harder you lean or the higher the load is, the more those stress profiles kind of press down, the higher the stress is in that soil. And this is really the prerequisite for compaction to occur. Once you get so much stress built up, that soil just can't withstand it anymore, and compaction will start. But it's also important to know that, the soil does have some strength to it. It has strength because it sticks to itself, kind of coheses to itself. In many different ways. It's got friction inside of it, but then also that soil is leaning on itself. It's leaning on its neighboring soil column and supporting itself there. But when those get really skewed off on how all these stresses that are building up, there's a lot of stress in the soil, eventually it breaks. And that's when compaction happens and particles start shoving into the pore spaces and clogging up that soil. And so in its most basic form, you can think about, if our soil started off non-compacted, kind of like this figure on the left, where we've got these mineral grains in it, we've got the soil particles, and they're wrapped in these films of water, but there's plenty of air in there too. Once it fails and that soil compacts in, all that airspace just basically is given up. And so now what's available is mostly water, and very little air through it. And for a root to go through this, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to press on the minerals, form these stresses that can occur around it, and it's got to force its way through that. And at some point, it's just hard for that root to be able to overcome and actually cause this compacted soil to then remold and create new pores for that root to go through it. Now, one of the things to really keep in mind is that it's very dependent on moisture out in the field. Wetter soils tend to be weaker than drier soils because water is a lubricant and those soil particles can slide past each other much more easily. But if we think about kind of how that happens as we go along with different amount of moistures, let's kind of look at this cartoon over on the left here. If we look at use bulk density as a measure of compaction, and we look at more and more and more moisture along the bottom here. So this brown dotted line on the bottom is kind of like what it would be before compaction occurred on a field. You have some bulk density that's particularly low, and you drive on it and it's relatively dry and nothing happens. No compaction occurs. But then you add a little bit more water and it's just enough to weaken that soil and get particles slipping past each other, and you start sinking in. That tire sinks in and it compacts up to a certain point before it stops. You add a little bit more water, it lubricates it more and compacts more, and it keeps going up and up and up as you get more and more moisture. You'll notice kind of here when we're very, very high moisture, it kind of comes down a little bit, but it's still compacting a lot. And this is really just an artifact of the water can't get out of the way fast enough. You literally start standing a little bit on those water films that are in that soil. So something to bear in mind is, when you have like ponded conditions or it's just, sopping wet out in the field, when it dries just a little bit, it's actually just as weak and prone compaction, if not a little bit more. So it's valuable to know, how much drier do you need to get before you start supporting the weights of equipment and other materials out there. And then, of course, the beginning strength of your soil matters too. So we can look at this right cartoon over here. And we just look at these other kind of curves, just like in the first one, how much compaction occurred. In a weak soil that's been historically aggressively tilled and fluffed up and innately made weak just through the activities out there, it's going to compact when it's, even when it's relatively dry. It's going to peak out on its maximum compaction pretty easily. But as that soil gets stronger and stronger, it can support loads even when it's wetter. And when it does fail a little bit, it's not nearly as severe for it. And this is where soil aggregation is the strength for it. It's where roots have already pre-compacted little bundles of soil to make them strong to stand up on. The roots have built in their form of compaction in the form of aggregates, which are beneficial to them. And there's a lot of different types of compaction out there when you think about all the stresses out of it. One of the most notorious ones is wheel traffic, as we'll keep talking about. But then there's also the classic tillage pans that can occur because there is down pressure on those implements, and you get these tillage pans that happen in the couple inches right below the depth where the shanks are set at. And then also just exposed soil from the energy impact from rainfall. That can cause compaction too. And that's what surface crusting really is just a thin zone of compaction due to the stresses that rain has on itself when it's coming down at its terminal velocity and hits the soil without being intercepted by residue or something like that. So a lot of different kinds of compaction. The wheel traffic one I really want to talk about because this is the one that sticks around for quite a while for it. And if we look over, kind of the front wheel loads of combines or even the wheel loads of tractors, and we just look at their loads over the decades, they're going up and up and up. Our equipment's gotten bigger, actual loads have gotten larger, larger equipments, larger loads that go on the ground. So as we mentioned earlier, you put any load on the ground, you cause some stress below the ground, but the more load, the deeper that stress goes and the higher that stress value gets, and the risk for compaction really goes up. And so it's not surprising if you look at the depth of compaction over the decades too, they go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, kind of just paralleling or tracking right along with the size of our equipments there. And this orange line I want to emphasize here because this is around 20 inches. Mechanically, it is almost impossible to reach below this given our standard equipment that's available out there. Getting below 20 inches mechanically to break up compaction is very difficult, time consuming, and costly to do. So our compaction loads these days are below our mechanical means to alleviate them for the most part. So how long does it last? Well, this is a very pertinent question given the topic for today. Compaction is a multi-year consequence. This is some data from a while back down by in the Mankato area, but you see this in other studies around the world too, and more recently in the region too, to where once you have a compaction event, a one-time compaction event, you can drop crop yields 20-30% quite easily in that area and for that year. The next year, there might be some level of recovery. It varies based on what the weather year was that year and where you're at in your crop rotations. But then it can take 3, 4, 5 years before it really heals back to its previous yields. But then even afterwards, if you were down below that deep compaction, it can come back in years that are either really dry or really wet. On this right here, this first data point right here, where it dropped down, getting 12, 15% loss, that was on a particularly drought year. These next 2 years were when they had about 150% of the usual rainfall. So wet years. So you kind of have this long-lived deep compaction that comes back on adverse weather years and will reveal itself again decades later. And I'll give a feel for that. This is some soil cores that were taken in Finland on clay loam soils over there. And this was taken, these cores, what you see here, these are CT scans. So like what you'd have done medically. The white area is actually all the soil pores, and the dark areas is the solid portion, the minerals and such. So you can see a lot of macropores in between these two pores, but they look a little different, right? The one on the right doesn't have nearly as many pores in general, let alone well-connected pores as the one on the left. And what this is from, these cores were taken between a foot and a foot and a half below the soil surface after one time compaction event during a harvest 3 decades earlier. The one on the left was not compacted. It was out of the compaction zone. But the one on the right here was in that compaction zone 3 decades earlier. And you can see that long-term persistence of just deep compaction that can exist. And one of the things, in our region that's often talked about is freeze-thaw cycles can help alleviate this. And freeze-thaw cycles can help alleviate surface compaction, generally close to the surface. This is just a screenshot from Indon that you can get if you just look up Indon deep soil temperatures. You can look at this at any or a lot of their weather stations. And these blue bars are where the ground is frozen. This is from last winter. But if you look right now in Fargo and Grand Forks area, it's only where the frost level's not even a foot down. It's very thin because of our blanket of snow that we have out there right now insulating it. But really in this surface kind of few inches, you think about the top 5 inches or so, there's many freeze-thaw cycles that happen, dozens of them that happen throughout a year. And every freeze-thaw cycle, every one of those can help alleviate a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. But it takes dozens of freeze-thaw cycles to alleviate compaction. Once we get below 5 inches, particularly getting down a couple feet, it usually freezes once and it thaws once. So unlike that surface couple inches that can get a couple dozen freeze-thaw cycles, it could take a couple dozen years for the deeper soil to get that many freeze-thaw cycles and get a chance to even start trying to break up that soil compaction. So deep soil compaction is not alleviated by freeze-thaw cycles in our region, even though we have some pretty harsh winters. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jodi to talk about some of the factors affecting compaction.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. Okay, there's actually quite a few different factors that affect compaction, but we're going to talk about the ones that maybe we have a little bit more control over. So soil moisture isn't always one that we have control over. We can't control Mother Nature. We can control about maybe going out into the field a couple days later, and there's that balance between getting things planted and getting out there when it's too wet. We understand that definitely. But then there's also soil aggregation, which Aaron talked about a little bit, and I'll go through a little bit more on how to keep soil aggregation. Axle loads, our tire size and our pressure of our tires is definitely up to us. And the number of passes that we make through a field will also contribute to how much compaction we're going to have. So soil aggregation is your number one defense against soil compaction. So what it is, these little aggregates here, like you said, it's the roots, compacting the soil into little bitty peds, and they're about the size of a pea or less, and they act like little mini columns in the soil that help hold up the weight of equipment. So if you can build this up, then that's your number one defense that you can have with compaction to prevent it. So what is the difference between a well-structured or aggregated soil versus one that is just fine particles and no aggregation? These are two extremes, but in this one, for full disclosure, is under grass. It's a grass system. So I don't usually see this in soil pits when I go out to a cropping system. I'll see somewhere in between here, but we try to get it as close as we can to this, because you can see that air and water can get into this soil very quickly. You have those large pore spaces that can get that water down quick. And you also have the smaller pore spaces that will hold on to that water later on in the season when you start getting the drouthy times, July and August, and have water for the plant there. And also the oxygen for microbes and plant root growth is critical. Over here has been a field that's been moldboard plowed for many, many, many years. And you can see that this corn root is having a really difficult time trying to get through this soil. If you see a corn root that's all poofy like this, it's trying to, literally be able to shove through these cracks. And what you'll notice too is that you don't have all the little root hairs coming off to the side. They just can't grow through that soil. And they're not exploring this area for nutrients and water, and you really start seeing stressors on the plant. And Aaron showed that you could get like up to a 30% yield decrease, but it can be all the way up to 60%. But like I said, there's so many factors. It's hard to say if you do 1 + 2, you'll get this much decrease. But we do know that it can be a huge problem. The other problem with it is that you have these individual particles when you're in a soil that has no structure or aggregation. And then these can blow away easily in the wind, can be washed away with water. Erosion can really take off with it. And the problem with that is you're going to lose your organic matter. And your organic matter kind of acts like a sponge in the soil, also helping to hold up equipment, making it a more robust system so that you do get more aggregation. So it's kind of a double whammy when you have a very poorly structured soil. You can see here with a well-structured soil that it's going to take the wind and water more energy to be able to blow or wash that away. What happens to aggregation? How do you build it? How do you destroy it? Tillage is by far the number one way to destroy it. And so how do we minimize this kind of damage? Because you can still do some tillage and be fine with aggregation, but you got to be a little bit mindful about what you're doing. Points and shanks will actually help the soil or keep more structured. And the reason why is because it goes through the soil and lifts and separates the soil along its natural planes. So that helps keep more of that aggregation and does less destruction to the soil. So chisel plow, field cultivator, things like that are better for structure than discs. And we'll show that in a second. Now, also with points and shanks, there's a lot of variability. So if you get more like the mole knife, or you get something that's thinner and not as twisted, then you move less soil and you turn over less soil, and then you're breaking down less aggregation. So if you have a chisel plow and you want to keep more aggregation, then one, I would shallow it up, and two, I would go with the smaller knives or a mole knife. Now, discs are very, very destructive. And the larger the disc, the deeper you're going, the more aggregation that you're taking away. So when you're looking at a road being built, you almost always see a disc on the side. And the reason why is because it tells the soil where to cut and break and makes a lot of individual particles. And that's great for a road bed, because then it will settle and you won't get, the wonky road beds during the year after they create that. Now, we don't want that in the field. We don't want individual particles. It really is a huge compaction issue. The other thing about discs is that they shear the soil. You got that nice smooth metal that will also cause compaction with the smearing on the side of it too. So not only does it break up aggregation, but it smears the soil. So if you are going to use a disc, I would say to keep it shallow. Go more with the like the 3-inch discs, the speed discs. The problem with that, though, is if you make all those small particles on the top of the soil, it's harder for rainfall to get in, and you'll get more soil crusting, which is another form of compaction. Moldboard plow totally inverts the soil, turns it upside down. And it's the most aggressive tillage system we have out there. And some people ask me, well, why do you talk about no moldboard plow? We don't use it. And I'm like, drive around. You'll see it out there a lot more than you think. My husband and I were coming up from the cities back home, and there he told me too, there's no more moldboard plows. And we saw 3 of them in the rain in the fall. And I was like, yeah, they're still there. They're the most aggressive tillage. They need the most energy, fuel, time, and they need more passes in the spring to get it back into planting shape. So it also has the highest erosion potential and breaks down the most structure or aggregation in your soil. So if you can get away from moldboard plowing, that would be the first and best place to start. Okay, so this is kind of shows you what happens with water infiltration when you disc, and that you make really fine particles everywhere, versus strip till, where you're only tilling right in the middle, and then you're leaving this part untilled. And you can see after rainfall that where it's has very fine particles or not good soil aggregation, that the water sits there in ponds longer. Here in strip till, you can get into that field faster. And if you ask any co-op which field they're going to go spray right after a good rain, they will go to the strip till, no till, and ridge till fields first. And that's because they can get water down into them quickly, and then you can get back on that field. Number 2 is reducing our axle loads. This is not something, while this is a grain buster or a bin buster, yay, we don't want this for out in the field. Anytime you put a grain extender onto the combine, you definitely add to the weight of it. So let's look at some of the weights out there. We have a slurry tank, and slurry tankers can be pretty heavy out on the field, but the way that they have fixed it, they have actually looked at minimizing the compaction that they have out there, their axle loads. And a 4,200 gallon tank with 2 axles, while it's at 10 to 12, if you put another axle on there, that would break it down even more and have less loads on there. So they've done that with like a 7,500 gallon tank. They put on 3 axles, you're at 11.5, 8,500 at 15, 8,500 with 4 axles, 11. So putting on the larger tires, you'll see them out there with combine tires, and also more axles is one way to really reduce your amount of weight out there. You want to stay between 5 and 10 ton per axle, and the closer to 5 that you can get, the better. But you're going to see that's pretty difficult for us in Minnesota and North Dakota. The Class 9 combines are 590 horsepower with 2 axles. Even with 2 axles, they're 20 ton an axle load. That's putting pressure into the soil at least 3 feet. So Aaron, we can show that compaction can actually go 4 feet into the soil. It's usually when I'm in a soil pit and I see tire compaction, I can see it down about 15 feet, and that's visually. If I had some instruments, I'm sure I could actually detect it deeper than that. Grain carts are really tough out there. It wasn't too long ago that 720 bushel was the normal size, but now we're getting up to 1,200 bushel, even up to 2,000 bushels, which if you have a 2,000 bushel grain cart, please keep that on the side, empty on the end of the field. Don't, unload on the go out in the field. At a 1,200 bushel, you're already at 35 to 40 ton an axle load, and that is pushing soil pressure down and the compaction really deep into the soil. The 2,000 bushel grain carts are actually about 76 ton an axle, and it doesn't matter if you have tracks on there or tires. That is a number that your soil cannot support. And then if you look at our tractors, something smaller like 200 horse, it's only 7.5. And that's the front axle. Again, with 325, it goes up, 530, 18 ton an axle load. This one here is, a quad track from Case. And if you look at that compared to your Class 9 combine, you're almost as heavy as a loaded combine out in the field. And, we think of our tractors as much lighter, not causing as much compaction, but because of our equipment weights going way up, they are causing a lot of compaction. And the problem is when you can't see compaction, some years it's great. You can't see it because if you have timely rains and well-placed fertilizers, your plant may grow right through it. But when you have those extra stressors, like Aaron showed on the graph, like it too wet or too dry, it just adds one more stressor that the plant can't take, and compaction really shows its ugly head. So the depth of compaction, I kind of mentioned this a little bit. This one is showing up to 16.5 tons an axle load. Will go down about 24 inches. And there is actually a lot of studies on this. It depends what kind of barriers you have in your soil and things, and the dryness as you go through the soil depth. So there's a lot of factors, but you can get down to 3 or 4 feet. This one's a shallow one, this photo. He had field cultivated when it was wet. And we think, oh, shallow, it looks pretty dry. I can go out there. But remember, a field cultivator has those flat sides to it, which just smear the soil. We have a lot of clay in our soil, and it just smears really nice. So you can see that the plant was having a terrible time just at 3 inches, which will not support its weight as it gets older. Number 3, you want to properly inflate all your tires. How many of you guys go out and check your tire pressure every day? Yeah, I don't either. I like my car because it tells me when my tire pressure is too low or too high. And that should be in a tractor too, you would think. But look at all your tractors, the tankers that are out there, the trucks that are out there. Bigger tires mean you can have a lower tire pressure. You want to be ideally around 10 PSI. That is difficult to do. Radials are much better than bias ply, although there are some new bias ply coming out that you can have the lower inflation rates. So these tires here, the best bang for your buck to lower PSI is to go with a larger tire, and then go with another axle if you're able. So this is just one study. There are many, many studies on tire pressure. And this is looking at a decrease in soil porosity. So the higher this number is, the more porosity was taken out. So the more compaction, more squeezing of that soil was there. And if you look at, this was using the same tires. And then if you overinflated them in the 4 to 8 inch depth, you were decreasing your airspace by 88%. So that means you have very little pores to get water down into your soil, to get air into your soil. And then as you go deeper into the soil, it diminishes. But even at 20 inches, they were at 36, a decrease of 36%. When they properly inflated their tires at 6 PSI, then you're looking at about half of the pores were smushed. And then it went down from there too. But it's a lot less, just same tire, just proper inflation. And we're not talking about underinflating. I don't want you losing tires off the rim and things like that. There are new equipment. Well, they're not that new. Tire Boss has had them for a long time for your semis, where it will automatically inflate and deflate these tires. As you go into the field, you push a button, it will deflate the tire. Because I know when you go on the field, when you're driving on a road, you want to be, say, 30, 36 PSI. And then when you're in the field, because you're going much slower, you can actually get down to 10 or 11. And that's a huge difference in the amount of pressure and intensity of that compaction you're creating. But I don't know anybody who's going to inflate, deflate their tires manually. It just takes too much time. This one, I go up in airplanes quite a few springs, and you can see all your tire tracks out there. And you can compact up to about 70% of the field with just all the operations that we do, especially when we either harvest at an angle or that we till at an angle. Those will show up. So trying to control your traffic patterns is important. There's also the one pass versus the multiple passes. So compaction happens almost up to 80% can happen on the first pass, depending on the soil moisture and soil aggregation. So you want to use that to your advantage. That's why you want to control your traffic patterns, because you can limit where that compaction is going to be in the soil. This is one where they had taken out a windbreak right along this edge here. And so they had the trucks drive in, and this farmer was very careful with controlling the trucks that went in and out, and it was right in this area. And you can see that it was where they had wheel traffic, it was still 45 bushel an acre, which floors me, because these guys just don't, soybeans are so adaptable though. And here's the soybeans where they weren't any traffic, and they were 59 bushels. So about 14 bushels less down here. If you would have had a drier year or other stressors, this could have been even higher. But controlling your traffic, if he would have run over that whole field with the trucks trying to take out the old trees, he could have had even, these would have been reduced to almost 80%. Here's some of the traffic pictures that I see up in the plain. Now that a lot of people have drones, put them up, look at what's going on in that field. When things look even from the road, that's great, but they are all over the place. And they stay there a while. If you want to get rid of compaction, now remember, your number one defense is your structure or aggregation. So if you do more tillage, you're going to bust that up and set you up for more compaction. So you want to go in with a straight shank. First, make sure you have compaction and you know where it is. Usually it's in the lower lying areas, because that's where it stays wet the longest and it's easier to compact. And you go in with a straight shank. You go in at your row spacing, so either 30 or 22, but not 15. And then you just go in once, because you can always do more tillage, but you can't take away the effects of the tillage if you do it more. I don't like the parabolic shank, because again, that throws soil up and over and it mixes soil. I would rather you go in with the straight shank. It takes a lot of horsepower for this, but nothing's easy when it comes to compaction. Also remember, in our dry years, like this last one, we have really good natural tillage. So if your soil cracks in the summertime, you are actually doing deep tillage. As deep as that crack is going, that's tillage. So this is a Fargo clay loam. Awful, awful soil. It has a lot of clay. And this one is cracking down. It went down to over 4 feet. So you're doing really deep tillage that way. It's the only silver lining to a drought year. Also, I want to invite you to the Northern Soil Compaction Conference that we have on January 26th, 27th. It's in 2 weeks, and it is from 9 to 1 each day. It's virtual. And we will have specialists from Sweden, Ohio, Manitoba, Ontario, across the US. Me and Aaron are going to, pitch in a little bit here. And it's an awesome place to learn all about compaction.
Well, thank you for your presentation. We have several questions that have already come in. Elaine asks, how is it that a 2,000 bushel grain cart on tracks can have the same axle load as a grain cart on tires?
So it's going to be a question of PSI and axle load. So the track will, if you take the track, it's the length and the width of the track by the weight that's on it. And a lot of times it gets down to 7 PSI, which overall sounds great. But if you look at a track, you have the guide wheels in between, and you carry pressure points on every guide wheel that spike down into the soil. And what that does is increases that pressure and gives you a higher number. So when you're looking at just PSI, it will not, there's more to it than that. The other thing is that you still have the same axle load, right? You may have a larger footprint, which will help you with traction. Traction, no doubt, tracks are better for traction, but it doesn't lessen the compaction out there. People think they're kind of a magic bullet, and they're not. So Aaron, do you want to help me explain that a little better?
Yeah, I think what you said is spot on. And, one way to think about it is when you spread that footprint out, whether it's by, if you can accomplish that by a track, or if you can accomplish that by lowering the PSI, you should be able to accomplish that by lowering the PSI in your tires. But when you get that larger footprint, the zone in the soil that it's going to help the most is kind of in the top bit, the shallower portion for it. So PSIs and everything are great for the surface, trying to help out with surface compaction, that middle layer of compaction. But in the end, a certain axle load is still just so big. And that's what pushes the depth that these stresses reach at. So your axle loads kind of control how deep the compaction goes in the first place. The footprint and the spreading it out helps out the severity of it, but it doesn't really change necessarily the depth that these stresses are still reaching.
So a question that we got both before this particular session started during registration, and then today from Randy, they both want to ask about some of our newer tillage implements. So can you please comment on vertical tillage and the impact on compaction?
Yeah. So, when you think about shallower, less aggressive tillage for it, if you're going out there in the field and using it when it's not too wet, then you shouldn't have, additional compaction. You should be potentially less for it because the piece of equipment may even weigh less and the down pressures aren't as high for it. But one of the tendencies that we often see is thinking, if I go shallower and less aggressive, I can also get out earlier when it's wetter and run it. And that's actually the benefits that you could get from less aggressive tillage and shallower tillage. You can erase those benefits by going out earlier when it's wetter for it. And it's because that soil still, when it is holding so much moisture, it's still weaker than what it would have been when it was a little bit drier. And these shallow implements, going at higher speeds and out in the fields, and especially if you have some that have concave implements on them, you're just smearing it. So that's when you start seeing people talk about, I switched to a vertical till or a high-speed compact disc, and I noticed this 3 inches down, I just got this layer that's hard. It was used when it was too wet, is what that means. If it wasn't too wet, you shouldn't see that.
Yeah, and vertical till is different than the discs. I mean, the discs have concavity to them, where vertical till is more of a wave and straight up and down. So it does a little less damage, but vertical till can go into the field. If your tractor can go, the vertical till can go. So it's kind of a, hey, I can get out there. So vertical till is, to me, better than using a disc, because you saw that smear layer for that corn plant. If you smear a layer at 3 inches and you plant your seed at 2, And then you only have an inch for those roots before they start hitting an impediment there. Whereas if you're at least smeared at 6 or 8 from your regular tillage, at least it gets down a little bit further and a little bit stronger root before it hits the compaction layer. So just be careful with the moisture, even on the shallow implements.
Anonymous asks how they break up compacted layers in soil that tends to stay wet, moist, and dry.
Wet, moist, and dry?
Well, three different soils.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, so the range of soil moisture. Okay. Aaron, you want to take that?
Yeah. So starting with probably the simplest one, when it's dry, you're not worrying too much about compaction, because that when the soil is drier, it's going to be stronger in the first place. As long as, unless you're on a very sandy soil that just doesn't have much ability for minerals to stick to themselves. The sticky stuff in the soil is the organic matter and the clays. So that helps, that soil stick together. If you're basically on sand dunes out there, then it can be dry and you're still going to compact in. But sands are much, much more forgiving with compaction than finer texture soils, just because even when they compact, they still have relatively large spaces in between the grains for it. Now, when you get into very wet conditions that are perpetually wet, that's when you need to start thinking about some other water management tool for it. One of the things that Jodi and I have talked about before on many occasions is you can't fix a water problem with tillage necessarily. You need a different tool to altogether, some kind of drainage plan or something like that. Because if you have a drainage problem, tillage won't solve it for you. And that's going to be an area that's going to be perpetually prone to compaction. And as we saw, once you compact, it's at least a multi-year effort or process just for it to come back out of that compaction. But we produce every single year. So even in an area that may be starting to improve, the chances in that wet area for just recompacting it is going to be very high every single year. So really controlling your traffic in those areas, really controlling the PSIs, getting your tire pressures right and everything in there, and trying to touch it as little as possible. Really, if it's just perpetually wet, unless you can get in there with some more aggressive tool for water management, like drainage or something like that.
Or cover crops.
Yes.
Cover crops also help with the trafficability of, if you have enough out there. It's based on biomass and the root structure. But one, it's using the water and respiring it off, so that helps. And the other thing is it's forming soil structure really well. It's one of the best things to help get more structure and aggregation into your soil. And then it also has some carrying capacity to it. Also, I think one time you had asked about no-till, and that guys are seeing harder soils out there when they're pure no-till. And I think that has to do with not controlling your traffic well. You really need to control your traffic because you have no other options to dig it up, and get rid of it. And unless you start putting in cover crops and, having long season cover crops in there will help break that up.
And I'll add on to that too, 2019 was really a hard year for compaction all the way around. Wet spring and then a wet fall, and it was just difficult conditions to operate in. One of the things that's going around talking to producers that we noticed was for the folks that were just in their first couple of years trying to go into no-till, that was difficult because their soils hadn't had a chance to naturally kind of build up their strength and aggregation to hold equipment up. And that's just, the timing was really difficult. But then for the folks that had been in the no-till for 5 or so years for it, they were standing up on their soils, going about their operations more close to business as usual, where the neighbors were buried up to the axles and just, one into the field, every single pass of a combine, ruts occurring. And then they had to go out and try to fill in those ruts because you can't leave them for the next crop out there. So there's a time investment getting into that 5 or more years in the no-till, and that strength builds up, and you start not having to worry as much about these compaction issues out there because your soil has become stronger.
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest ways I get guys to transfer over to strip tills. They'll call me up and said, I'm tired of getting stuck in pulling out the combine in the fall. And he said, my neighbor does strip till and he's in all the time. And it's like, well, let's give it a try. I know that one tillage system is not for everybody, but helping to decrease the depth, the aggressiveness, the number of passes out there will help with compaction, as well as keeping more structure and getting the benefits of structure.
So what about duals on tractors or combines? Will that help to lower compaction?
Yes, if you lower your PSI. So look on the charts. I'll see a lot of people who will they'll keep the same PSI on the inner duals and they'll just lower it on the outer duals. And it's like, no, look at the charts because you can lower it quite a lot. If you're not taking advantage of that, then duals give you more traction. But if you keep the same PSI, they're not going to help with compaction. So that is, I don't want to sound like I'm against tracks, but that is one of the benefits of tracks is it's kind of like lining duals up in a row versus, widening out your compaction area.
So Kelly asks an interesting question. So complimentary about this presentation, but really wonders about all of the conventional fertilizers, and with our poor drainage and high EC soils, how are the salts in the soil basically affecting our soil compaction and soil health above and beyond physical, compaction caused by equipment?
Yeah, so salty ground is a soil health issue all in its own realm almost. It's salinity adds one more stressor to a lot of things that are out there. But then also in this region, we got to think about just not the amount of salinity, but the type of salinity. So when I think about physical properties and salts and stuff, my mind oftentimes goes right away to sodicity issues for it, which,
right.
One of the things that with sodic soils is they self-compact. And we have soils that some of them naturally have high sodic conditions near the surface. Those are somewhat easier to ameliorate with gypsum and stuff like that, because you can actually get the amendment in that zone. But we have other soils that naturally have it down 3-4 feet deep. And it's just getting product down there to help get that sodium out and then let it start naturally uncompacting down at that depth is a long-term process for it. And then we run into issues where we have saline sodic down at that area. People will put in tile drains down at that depth for the salinity part to try to remove the salts and improve the soil health. And you'll see some improvement in the first few years, a handful of years that come out and things look great, but then that sodium doesn't really leave that fast. It leaves slower than the other salts. And so once you leave sodium by itself, it'll just kind of seize that soil up and self-compact. And now you have an entirely different problem that's, again, very difficult to reach. So, with the salts in the area, knowing the type of salts, that could be a very big hindrance to soil health in the region. And when you have saline conditions, it's like perpetually having drought conditions. The plants have a hard time taking up water, which means your nutrient program in that area a lot of those nutrients are going to be left behind in that soil. We oftentimes see our highest phosphorus, soil test phosphorus, our highest nitrate concentrations in saline soils because we may be not, lifting up the implements and we just fertilize right through it in some cases in these smaller patches. But when the plants aren't growing that well, they're not taking up that fertilizer either, and that's just a loss on your fertilizer investment there.
Also with saline soils, they wick up through the soil, and if your soil particles are closer together, it can get up easier than if your soil particles are further apart. So the more tillage you do, the more you take out that porosity in that structure and make it everything closer together. So when you do more tillage, you're able to wick up more salt. So again, that's another benefit to aggregating your soil. But like Aaron says, it's a little bit harder to do in a salty or sodic soil.
So we have Dorian here. He asks, and a person before the webinar also asks about whether there's a crop that makes soil less prone to compaction or a cropping system.
You want to vary your roots and put in cover crops wherever you can. If you can, I know wheat doesn't always grow so great as we go south, but just getting another crop in rotation, adding in cover crops, all of that, those roots can help aggregate the soil. Sweet clover is very good at aggregating soil. The radishes are better at penetrating through the soil. So if you have issues with compaction, they can get through. Yeah, anytime you can add to your rotation and still have a market for it.
Yeah, I like that answer a lot, the diversifying your root portfolio, if you will, out in the field. It's roots add strength to the soil, even themselves too. It's kind of like putting rebar in concrete. It innately adds more stability and structure to it. And there is, fine root systems work great in that regard of kind of adding more, as Jodi mentioned, the radishes, they can go down and they can start kind of chiseling and breaking through some of these hard layers. But it's these finer root systems that then, once you can kind of get through them, that then act as rebar and concrete, if you will, and add some strength to that ground for when you're driving over it next. Some plants are fine root systems are not very good at getting through compaction. They're just not very strong for it. Other ones are very aggressive and can go through a lot of things. And it's a lot to kind of give a blanket answer on one particular crop or another, but something to be looking out for in the future too, that I think may be coming up in the next handful of years is more crops that are designed for this, because the research looking at the genetics and everything of crops, of what makes some of these very good at going through compaction layers and other ones not, is making a lot of grounds in the last few years. And we're getting a much better understanding of just not the root's mechanical strength to be able to go through a compaction layer, but also roots that will attempt to go through it in the first place. Because it's a lot of roots, when they encounter a zone that's hard to go through, they can actually sense it because they're giving off ethylene and it's gassing off. And if that ethylene can gas off away from it, it's not compacted, it can get through the airspace for it, the root will tend to want to keep going. But once it starts sensing that there's getting this accumulation of ethylene cloud kind of around it, it'll set off hormones that will make that root start turning off, and it'll invest in roots going in other directions for it. And in that case, that crop's not even trying to go through the compaction layer. It's trying to find a less resistant route through it. So we're getting a better understanding of that. And hopefully we'll have some crops that are targeted and designed specifically for this task of compaction.
Thank you.
That's cool.
Dorian asks another question about how a grower would determine how deep or severe compaction may be in order to formulate a mitigation plan.
Penetrometer. Go out there with a penetrometer, but that won't tell you everything, because if it's dry out, your soil's going to be bone hard and you won't get through it. But if you're a crop consultant, you do soil sampling, I bet you know exactly where that layer is. But what I find mostly in the soil pits that I'm in is that you'll have wheel traffic. So it's kind of a U shape. And that is, especially if you're moving your crop around, that wheel traffic will definitely inhibit yield. I don't find as many plow pans, mainly because people who were chisel plow or have moved to disc gripping, which has lowered their depth of tillage. But I'm sure at that depth, you're going to start seeing a tillage pan there too. So one, you need to identify a shovel is a great thing too. Go out there and find out where it's at, because you don't need to go remediate the whole field, I bet. Like a combine, as it's full or empty on one end of the field, and as it goes across the field, it fills up, gets heavier, puts more compaction down. So find out where it is at first, and then, then you remediate those areas, because if you remediate with iron, you're still destroying some of the structure. So you don't want to do that across the whole field. You want to be pretty select on where you go.
And the last thing I would add to it is, as a thought, is if you know areas where compaction happened, like 2019, you had ruts in some areas, you filled them in, you planted the next year if you didn't go into preventive plant, and then, you hope for the best right then. Well, you can come back that next year afterwards or sometime afterwards, and if you generally know where that was at, take the penetrometer and take a measurement, but don't just take them randomly. Kind of go across where you remember where those tracks were, because you'll find an area to where it's like, okay, it seems fine. Oh, there's that rut. And you can see if you can get through it and find where the bottom may be, and then keep going. And then, if a few rows later, oh, there was the other side for it. And at least then you have that comparison of like, here's where those ruts were, and a couple rows off to the side, it wasn't. And just comparing those, you'll get a better idea of like how deep it really went. And it may be deeper than what your penetrometer can actually go, if you had really severe ruts.
Yes, and we did do a rut study in 2009. It was really, really wet fall. And what we found in the 6 fields is that the farmers just filled them back in, they usually would, with either a disc grip or a chisel plow. And we could find those ruts for 2 years, 2 good years. They decreased yields about 19% in corn, 15% in beans the next year. And then by the 3rd year, I had them GPSed and everything, and I could not find the ruts with a penetrometer or that. So know that in about 3 years that they do dissipate. But Aaron mentioned a prevent plant. If you do have a prevent plant, get cover crops in there. Awesome place to put them in. They're doing work for you. They're keeping your soil alive for the next year. They're keeping the microbes alive that you'll need for the next year, especially like, sorry, my mind just blanked. Mycorrhizae, because they will be there to grab the phosphorus and moisture for you. So definitely a great place to use that.
And cut down on your the risk of building up a weed seed bank that then impacts the year afterwards. So yeah.
Right. Oh, and the other thing about finding out where that compacted layer is, like Aaron was talking about, then if you do find you have this compaction that's going 8-9 inches, and you see that straight shank that I showed you goes to 20, don't take a 20-inch shank to fix an 8-inch problem, because then you're destroying structure down even further and can set yourself up for deeper compaction. So if you find it at 8 inches, you'll want to go about an inch below that, and that will break through it. It will pop through as you're driving through.
We've reached 10 o'clock. Time flies when you're having fun. Thank you both for your presentation. I'm going to just close us out here today. Basically, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Jodi and Aaron, for presenting for our